Okay, good evening, everyone. Anybody out there? Good evening, everyone. That's better. It's a communication function here we got to do. So here's the way we thought we'd do the run of show, as we call it here close to Hollywood.
Makes me feel like I'm in Los Angeles.
And that's what we wanted. That's what we wanted. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, hopefully to provoke our guests and get the conversation going. And then I will open it up to questions from the floor. And when you have questions, I will invite you to step to the microphone and identify yourself and then ask the question. So that's sort of the run of show. So here's the first question I have for our two esteemed guests. I read the reviews, many of the reviews for the book. And I said, oh God, not another one of those. And that struck me because you read a lot of books these days about the transformative role of technology. If we drop a laptop into a village, it will transform social relations. If we can just get everybody linked up, all shall be resolved. And in some ways, much to my disappointment, because I was looking for a great argument with my two friends here, the book is not like that at all. It's actually much more nuanced and balanced between social forces on the one hand and institutional forces and history and culture, and how the technology drops into those kinds of situations and affects the outcomes. But they point out that good guys and bad guys can have access to the technology. So my question is, how the hell did you get that balance right? What did you bring to it that allowed you to do that, Eric?
We've been working on this for a couple of years, and when we started, we didn't quite know where we were going to end up. And we sort of come to a view that in the next 5 to 10 years, another 5 billion people are going to join the internet. These are people from a lot of countries that we've not visited, even Jared and I. And this will be transformative on them in a way that you cannot imagine. They're going to go from abject poverty, no textbooks, no information, rote learning, to the world's information in their own language, education, medicine, healthcare. You talk to these people, and your heart goes out. And all of a sudden, with this single device, they're going to know all of this. This is going to happen. It's a core aspect of the empowerment of the internet and mobile devices. It will, of course, also empower bad people as well as good people. And governments and citizens and companies will all react to this in ways that we take through, as you said. And we worry about governments doing a whole bunch of things. Jared?
Well, and if you think about the next 5 billion people that are connecting to the internet, look at where they live. They live in parts of the world where there's conflict, instability, where the model of governance is autocratic and repressive. They're going to encounter a unique set of challenges with tools that we're all familiar with every single day in the future, and it's going to look very different than the first 2 billion people that are already connected. So the narrative of this book, in a lot of respects, was the two of us traveling to 30-plus countries together over the last several years to meet these future users, to understand some of the challenges they're encountering with or without technology, and to try to understand what would get worse, what would get better, because you have to have an honest conversation about what awaits us. The world's not perfect. It's very easy to be optimistic, but it's dishonest.
And I think, to summarize some of the points that we've sort of come to, it's true that terrorists will have access to information they wouldn't before, but it will be very difficult for terrorists to evade the tracking and the surveillance and so forth that the police can do. It's very difficult to do that in a digital world without being caught. We have lots of examples of that. Governments that are going to be threatened by empowering citizens are going to initially turn off the internet, which is a real wake-up call to the citizens and a mistake. And then once they discover that's a mistake, they're going to start filtering information that they don't like. And the citizens will then come back trying to bring that information back. And various forms of internal civil war about information will happen. And in fact, governments will engage in complicated cyber war even while they're friendly in the physical space. And we talk a lot about that in the book.
One of the things that struck me in reading the book, and before I got the hard copy, which I was delighted to get, I had to download it on this thing. So I'm bimodal. I read half of it on this and the other half here. So I figure I'm using all sorts of platforms. The question I would pose to you is that you identify sort of 3 groups, those at the top of society, those at the middle of society, and those at the bottom of society. And rather than saying all of the impacts are going to be the same, all of the uses are going to be the same, you actually differentiate and say, let's not say that someone living in Bel Air is going to have the same reaction or use it in the same way as someone living in Watts. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you thought about that, how you came to that conclusion, and maybe think about the implications for those three groups.
Let's talk about the wealthy information communities, these Bel Air and many others in America and in the Western world. These are people who are going to have enormous improvements in their daily lives. When you wake up in the morning, there'll be some screen on the wall. It'll say, good morning, Eric, and I'll say, do I have to get up? And it'll say, no. You can go back to sleep. We've scanned all the things you're doing.
Can you promise that all of our screens will say that?
Well, in your case,
I think
Dean,
that's what we're
the problem being a dean is there's always a threat.
There's always a threat.
some problem. But what will happen is it'll analyze what's going on. You'll have given it permission to look at your schedule. It'll understand what sort of problems that you're facing, and it'll do an analysis for you. And it'll help organize your world. Think of it as an infinitely powerful, infinitely intelligent personal digital assistant. And people will choose this because their lives will get a lot easier. It'll predict a traffic jam. It'll say, Eric, you're always late to the LAX airport, and the traffic on the 405 is terrible. If you don't leave right now, there's no flight for the next week. Get out of bed. And these sorts of things.
And of course, some of the places that we traveled in sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, it's very clear that power and electricity problems are going to persist into the future. Food shortages, water shortages, violence, all these things will persist. Technology can help in terms of ushering in a new era of information, but it's certainly not a silver bullet. And so the distinction that we make is everybody's lives get better because of technology. There's no country in the world that's worse off as a result of the internet's arrival. It's just that it's going to be different degrees of assistance that individuals will get.
And the sad thing, by the way, is that I grew up with the assumption that the internet was a great leveler, and that you'd see a global middle class that would somehow erase all of these distinctions that we are all so used to. All of us are optimists with respect to the human condition, that everyone's raised up equally. But in fact, it's not the case. That in the developing world, the sort of bottom of the pyramid, which is where most people are, they're going to struggle to get to basic connectivity. It's life-changing for them, while we're busy arguing over how fast is our fiber optic connection.
And arguably, it is the case, for example, in the United States. I'm not making causality here, but I'm suggesting the correspondence that the more connectivity is happening at the same time that we're seeing greater and greater inequalities in the United States of America. And global connectivity is happening at the same time that we're seeing growing gaps between the poorest countries and the richest countries. So I'm not suggesting causality, but I'm making your point, I think, Eric, in a slightly different way, which is that it's not a panacea. And that these are enablers, we can do other things. But I want to, because I know that both of you have been to Rwanda. You've both been to Nigeria. Very different kind of environment than we're in today here in California. So I think we would have a good sense of how it's going to help our life. If you're in Mushin in Lagos, or Surulere in Lagos, or if you're in Rwanda, maybe you could say a little bit about the impact in those countries of the implications, if you will, of your book.
Well, the way to, first of all, there's an infinite number of examples, and in some respects, it matters what demographic you're talking about. So let's start with young people, right? The vast majority of the next 5 billion are going to be young. How do they learn? They learn through rote memorization in broken schools. And if you believe, as we do, that the source of many of the world's problems are rooted in bad educational systems, every young person with a smartphone in their hand is going to be able to challenge educational systems built on memorization with critical thinking just by virtue of their ability to informally learn over a mobile device. 5 billion people is 5 billion new witnesses who can capture atrocities on film, who can take photos, who even if the networks are shut down can still share them peer-to-peer. So progress in education, progress in witnessing and accountability, these are just some of the examples.
Well, and Jared wrote the definitive book on the Rwandan tragedy in 1994 when he was obviously a younger man, as a young man now.
I have wrinkles now.
And so when we were in Rwanda, it was like being with the world's authority of what happened. And I was struck by this image of 700,000 people killed by machetes in an event planned over 4 months, obviously despicable in every one of the great human tragedies of all, which was planned. And I imagine, could this happen today? And my conclusion was it could not, because somebody would have had a phone and said, this is madness.
Well, of course, one of the demographics that, of course, is top of mind right now is women. Right? So people always say, well, how will more connectivity impact women? Well, who are the majority of the people in the world? They're women. So it's not.
But the best example of this, and I'm sorry to go back to this, is in Pakistan. We visited a home for women who'd had acid thrown in their faces. And in this horrific crime, where half of the women die from the injuries and the other half are disfigured, it's so horrific that in addition to the pain, they're not allowed to essentially be members of society for the rest of their lives. They become trapped prisoners. They use the internet to have a new virtual life. And we heard stories, and you literally want to cry when you see these people, these innocent victims of this extraordinary male evil behavior.
And of course, one other similar example, when we were in Libya, we learned about Libyan schoolgirls who, during the NATO bombing in the anti-Gaddafi campaign, used Google Maps to map out where the bombing was taking place so that they could find a safe pathway to school.
So the point here is for the people in the audience who are from Google is, you think Google Maps matter? It matters a lot if you're being bombed, right? To find a safe route to school and you're a school kid.
And by the way, it was so useful that the NGOs followed the maps that were built by the Libyan schoolgirls to figure out how to safely distribute aid.
And after our North Korea trip, but after we got out of the country, we published the maps to the gulags to try to raise awareness of the horrible conditions that North Korea keeps its political prisoners and other prisoners, including an American who unfortunately has just been convicted of 15 years of crime.
I'm going to ask two more questions, and then we'll open it up to the group formerly known as the audience. Two quick ones. One is, so the two of you come from relatively different backgrounds. You're a little bit older, you're a little bit younger. You've had different experiences. You worked in the bureaucracy in Washington, which is where you and I first met. You've worked in enterprises in the West Coast. How did you write the book? What did you each bring that the other one didn't?
It's a very simple answer. We use Google Docs.
No, we seriously
why
did,
didn't
by
I
the
see
way.
that coming?
It's not just a shameless plug, we really did.
And the basic problem with Jared is he types twice as fast as I do. So we would sit there and we would compete. And I would type and he would type twice as fast. So that's the ratio of the words in the book, thanks to Google Doc.
Okay, but you were on the policy planning staff. And you worked both with Condi Rice and with Hillary, with David Gordon, Republicans. You worked with Democrats. You brought a particular perspective, perhaps, of politics in Washington and a certain view of world affairs. Eric comes from a very different background and brought presumably a different kind of perspective. So I want to push you a little bit on, I'm not asking you which page and which, but Eric, what did you bring uniquely to the book, and what did you also bring, Jared?
You know, all collaborations have different viewpoints. Jared brought an enormous understanding of foreign policy. I didn't take any of those classes. So he would explain to me these sort of historical things, you know, like the Treaty of Westphalia. For example, which everyone understands. Or the one, what's the World War I one that you keep trying to explain?
Eric and I.
Well, whatever it's, you just proved the point.
Well, no. Clearly, I need to repeat this more. But we, in the context of talking about what various conflicts will look like in the future, one of the things we've been speculating about is what a Guns of August moment would look like for cyberspace.
Like, what is Guns of August? Is that like a modern movie? You know,
and I said it's my favorite. It's my favorite history book of all time. And for those of you that don't know it, 1962, a woman named Barbara Tuchman wrote Guns of August, which became the seminal book on the causes of World War I. And what's so compelling about this great work of historical nonfiction is it shows how a bunch of overly zealous and posturing European nations each committed a series of miscalculations and missteps that ultimately propelled Europe into the First World War in a situation that was totally
So I just
avoidable.
explained to them this is non-deterministic random path dependence. And we sort of began the conversation from that point. So from my perspective, people in my world tend to see technology as determinative and tend to be relatively, have 10 years to the way humans behave. And politics is fundamentally about understanding human emotion, human judgment, and the fallibility of humans. I think we've come to a sort of a joint view. And when you actually read the book and you talk about these things, you discover that it's really a blend of technological determinism, that technology enables behavior, and I think we chart fairly clear that it is, but also that human beings are not completely rational, that the business of managing humans is messy, that people get excited, people get overwhelmed, and there's a lot of power games being played.
And to add to this, just to give you a concrete example of how this collaboration played out, I mean, obviously we traveled to different parts of the world, but there's not a single person that could have written this book on their own, because you need two types of expertise in order to look 10 years into the future when everybody's connected. So what we would do is we would say, let's look at a country like Saudi Arabia. What kinds of problems does Saudi Arabia have? Well, it turns out a lot. It's autocratic, and women have absolutely no rights. So then
it has a huge demographic bubble, which is disempowered. And in fact, the math of Saudi is such that if the current birth rates and growth rates, they won't be able to fund the lifestyles of the princes, and they'll impoverish their people. Sounds like a recipe for some big series of problems coming.
So of course, then what Eric does is he starts talking about what the technology is going to be doing in Saudi Arabia and starts speculating about how it might impact society. And ultimately, we come to the conclusion that for women in Saudi Arabia, the best solution to get around the secret police, who are known as the Mohabbarat, is they'll have an anti-Mohabbarat app that looks sort of like Uber. And they'll literally track the Mohabbarat.
And literally, women are very clever. They'll have these apps and they'll say, oh, there he is, I'm going that way, right? And because these people wear colorful headdresses, we can find them.
Okay, the last question before we open it up is, as an educator, I have to ask this question, because as I was reading this wonderful manuscript, I kept saying, okay, my job is to educate the next generation of younger people who are going to live in this kind of world. And they're going to have to be presumably no more about pattern recognition and thinking 360 degrees and global. So tell me your thoughts on what are the competencies and skills that you're going to look for, Eric, when you hire people in a great company like Google or other companies, so that they will be able to be successful in this kind of world.
We always look for sort of raw horsepower. In many of the industries, Google being one, experience is overrated and quickness and judgment is underrated, because the environment is changing all the time. And there are many ways in which you can detect those. We give people tests. Sometimes we actually test them. Sometimes we threaten to test them. Sometimes we actually look at the results. Sometimes we're just having fun with them. But the fact of the matter is, we take it very, very seriously. And this next generation of employees is going to be extraordinary, because they have grown up as digital natives. They've grown up with these devices all the time, and they think differently about how to solve a problem. They use networks differently. They're more social in many ways than we ever were. They've been better parented. Parents are spending more time with them, as a surprising result. And they also have a greater sensibility about the environment, the world around them, and working in teams. I think there's every reason to think that this next generation is going to be much stronger than the one currently in power.
And what I would add to this, because I come at it from a different perspective, which is I speak at a lot of universities, and people always ask, tough job market, what's our comparative advantage in the future? Eric mentioned that this is the first generation that's being brought up and socialized with high prevalence of connectivity and technological proficiency. Now, because people use it every day, they don't view it as an innate expertise that the older generations don't have. So I come from the world of government. In government, once people realized technology was important, they were desperately trying to backfill themselves with those technical skills. This generation that's graduating isn't going to have that problem. And so yes, some of them will go into the tech sector, but most of them won't. Most of them will go into health and medicine, some will go into academia, some will go into government, and their comparative advantage is knowing more about technology than the people that employ them. The opportunity to leverage that comparative advantage to actually excel and introduce and inject into these ecosystems a notion of reverse mentorship is ultimately how they will break through the hierarchies and change the game. But if they're not aware of that comparative advantage, it's not going to happen.
And I just want to underscore, having spent about 18 months traveling around talking to people like yourselves, saying, what are you looking for when you hire people? And what are you looking for when you promote them? I find similar reactions. I only wish that the educational institutions that I'm familiar with were able to respond with the same mobility and agility that you're talking about.
But it's interesting that the new generation will sort of teach their parents about this stuff, and there's a large set of interesting new choices of online education, which will provide some real metrics. So if you do an A/B test, which we teach in statistics, by the way, and a particular mathematical approach to teaching something actually produces a 10% or a 20% statistically valid improvement, you should adopt it. The educational institutions in America don't think that way. They think, oh, well, we've been doing this way for a long time. We're very comfortable with it. There's no particular reason to change. There's no incentive to change. And in order for America to meet the global challenges that we face, particularly from Asia and their commitment to education, plus the very large number of Asians that are coming into the middle class, we've got to fix this educational issue. And we have the tools now to measure outcomes, to improve connectivity, to deal with people in substandard teachings. It's time for us to adopt them.
The exception to the general rule, I will simply say, is the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, where our motto is innovate or die. Now let's open it up to the floor. Now if you would please go to the microphone and identify yourself.
And while we're waiting, can I just observe that this is the first time I've arrived at a talk by driving through a pair of binoculars? Very cool.
Hi everyone, my name is Juan Vasquez. I am with Urban Teens Exploring Technology, or Urban Techs. Thank you guys for having us. I have one question, and it circles back to the topic and an example that you kind of discussed earlier on. And bringing it back home, how do we get areas like Beverly Hills, just an example, to be encouraged and to really see the ROI that comes into investing in technology in areas like Watts or South Central? How do we get them to break down those barriers and realize that there's actually, it's not just goodwill, there's a tangible ROI that happens?
Let me ask you, do you want to take a couple of questions and then answer, or do you want to do it one
at a
okay, one at a time? Okay.
Let's do it quick.
Sure, that's fine.
I'm not as worried about the distinction that you're describing because the telecommunications companies tend to offer similar services across those two. So the platforms are not that dissimilar. And the wireless stuff is relatively ubiquitous in the two different places. So to me, your answer is really more about how do we create technological opportunities, and that's ultimately about small business formation, entrepreneurs, and so forth. The prices in Beverly Hills are so high, I would assume that the entrepreneurs are not actually locating there anyway. Startups should be in Venice, right, where things are cheaper or even beyond.
Thank you. Next.
Hey. Michael Witham, I'm from Phoenix. I'm curious, with Google in general, you guys always have a lot of products going on, and as you guys explore all these different atrocious places, how do you prioritize where to put your resources when you have unlimited resources, or at least to a certain degree? I mean, how do you choose between Rwanda versus Latin America or so forth?
One of the beautiful things about the internet is that you can have successful businesses without having to have businesses physically present in every country. So we have large revenue opportunities in many of these countries without having people, they fly in. So for example, we service Rwanda by people flying in from Nairobi. And we do have constraints. The constraints are not necessarily financial, but they're very much about people's time. And there's just a rate at which you can solve these problems. My focus has always been on the international component because I'm assuming that's where eventually all the growth will be, because eventually the Western world saturates, but there's lots and lots of people joining us. So it's good business as well as good morals to worry about the health of the whole world.
And then I guess kind of a follow-on, with the impactful projects you guys are working on, how do you make those decisions when lives are at stake, where it's like, do we help the women in Rwanda, or do we help the women in Pakistan, or wherever you said with the acid and things like that?
Well, I hope we have a single product that solves both categories. The trick is to find solutions that generalize. The more specialized the solution, the more difficult it is to deploy, the more expensive it is to serve. So if we could come up with a solution that would enable women who are in fear of bad men and doing bad things to them, and if we could do it, which is a common problem for women in the developing world, and we could generalize it using, for example, automatic notification, anonymous reporting, anonymous responders, and we've talked about that, that would be a significant improvement for all of them, independent of their situation.
Interesting. All right, thank you.
Hello, my name is Sheila Tejada. I'm a professor in computer science, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about this and how the digital age technology is going to change the world even more. I'm really interested in trying to strengthen the educational pipeline in computer science here in Los Angeles, because as you know, there is a crisis in our country about having enough computer scientists to create this technology of the future. I know you've been focusing mostly on the users, that we're having 5 billion more users, but what about the lack of creators, of engineers? How are we going to be creating the new engineers here in the U.S.?
Well, there's as you know, there's quite a shortage of candidates for the jobs that are open in computers and computer science across the IT fields. So the good news is if you choose to become a programmer or computer scientist, you will get a job, you will be hired. This is essentially zero unemployment, independent of your ability, right? And it's just the reality. That's how strong the shortage is. And so there's a set of ways to solve that. The first is to fix immigration reform. As you know from your university, we educate people and then we kick them out, where they go to other countries, they form companies, and take the money from us. It's a terrible public policy strategy. Of the list of bad decisions in Washington, this is clearly the worst. And there's a long list of candidates, right? The second thing is that we need more in the pipeline. And this country is not focused on math and education to the degree that, for example, the Asian countries are. We produce a significant number fewer on a percentage basis. So I've suggested, for example, as a public policy goal, we should have the same percentage of analytically trained young people in America as we do in Asia, right? Because they're not more analytic than we are because of some other reason. We're all the same.
Right. How are you proposing to get there, though?
Well, the government actually has to do something.
Okay.
And there's a long list.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
yes.
And otherwise, what will happen is we'll lose our leadership and the Asians will win.
Let me ask you this one. There's for a number of years, arguably, Northern California and the high-tech industry said Washington is way out there and we don't need to worry about Washington. We can solve all this. Washington should get out of our way. Lately, there seems to be more interest, both on the international front, as well as the SOPA-PIPA episode, and more recently, very interesting trend where those who are interested in largely Mexican immigration from Latin America, as you know, have formed a political alliance with those who are interested in more sort of skilled immigrants coming in from Asia. Do you see this as a trend of a greater sophistication on the part of the high-tech industries that might be able to address issues of education as well?
I would actually look at the question a little bit differently, which is, you can focus on SOPA and PIPA and you can focus on things at home, but there's actually a much more extraordinary trend that's taking place, which is, if you look at all the challenges that I used to work on in my old job, the challenges that, sexual and gender-based violence, illicit network, all these violent challenges that exist in the world. In the past, they seemed largely irrelevant to Silicon Valley, to tech companies, and to engineers. And the combination of more people coming online in these environments, greater visibility into the world's challenges, and an innate sort of altruistic spirit that exists within engineering communities has in some respects created a perfect storm that's propelling engineers into this silo-busting role. So engineers have never been more important to solving the world's problems than they are today. And I think a lot of what you're seeing and a lot of the new activism that's coming from the tech community is a result of that realization. I would argue we need to push it even further. So at Google, we work hard every single day to talk about some of the use cases and examples of Google in very unlikely places. Whether it's the Tunisian revolutionaries becoming Android developers or the Google Maps in Libya example that we gave before.
Good point. So we have maybe the next speaker. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is CK Lin. I'm an entrepreneur here in LA. My question is more of a general one. So what are your top 3 to 5 books, most influential books that help shape the way you think and act?
Well, the first one is this one.
Of course.
Right? That's number one.
Francis Fukuyama wrote a book which is the first of 2 books on the origins of political order. And he goes from caveman days to the French Revolution, where he conveniently stops after 500 pages. And for me, it helped understand why the world is organized the way it is, and why, for example, there are differences in China and India that have persisted for thousands of years. These are not things that I knew. And what typically happens with technical people is that you assume that people are identical. Right? Now, while we're certainly the same, as I said earlier, each of us grows up in a social and cultural context that does drive behavior. And I was surprised to find out that so much of the world's history is organized around tribalism. And Americans, because we grew up in a society where tribalism was essentially eliminated by the way in which the country was built, and we got rid of the native Indians by literally killing them way back when, so obviously horrific, we don't have an experience of tribalism. So when you understand that the users that you're bringing in, this is sort of the insight, are coming from a tribal context and a religious context, which is unfamiliar with you, you can then understand how they're going to use the tools in new and different ways.
And for me, I would say I read very dense historical nonfiction, and I watch Showtime miniseries. This is based on distorted
The Tudors, you
historical
love
myths.
the Tudors.
The Tudors is incredible.
Jared spent a whole year talking to me about the Tudors.
Basically, I became so obsessed with it that I decided I didn't want to read anything that was historical, factual.
Tell them what's in your house. Armor.
Well,
Tell them the truth.
I was deeply impacted by Showtime's The Tudors and decided to try to make my apartment look like it.
The problem is that when we travel, we've been to 30 countries, he has to buy one thing that's life-size and get it back on United Airlines or whatever in the baggage.
There was a life-size, what Eric's really referring to is this life-size ostrich it's really, this is an important point. I basically declared I was ready to buy something life-size, and we saw it on the side of the street, and everybody told me I wouldn't get it, and so I checked it underneath the plane and declared it as breakfast at the airport.
As breakfast or at breakfast?
Either. Both work.
So by the way, a new thing that I learned from Jared is that you can buy something very large and transport it on your airplane flight. Yes, sir.
My name's Gully Burns. I'm a research assistant professor at USC. And I have a question about truth. One of the things that you're talking about when you're talking about engineering and the role of engineering and the role of information engineering and information science is you get to kind of do amazing things with information. You create things, you create artifacts. And I'm witnessing, I'm a biomedical knowledge engineer. I'm trying to solve scientific problems and leverage the technology that we're talking about to try and cure cancer or cure Parkinson's disease, that kind of thing. Now, one of the things that I notice as a byproduct of the current information age is there's a massive exponential growth of misinformation. People are incredibly poorly informed some of the time because they can choose to just live in their little universe. And in a way that really troubles me. So my question to you is, okay, you've described the transformative effect of engineering and technology on the world, but what about the kind of transformative effect of knowledge and deep knowledge, not just kind of superficial question answering, oh, I have this little factoid, I can give you a little piece of information, but are we really transforming the world to make it wiser and have a deeper knowledge about the underlying cures for cancer, but also the underlying causes of abuse of women, for example, which is you just mentioned. Can you comment on that, please?
I agree with that. A lot of the answer depends on whether you actually believe that facts exist, and you should begin a conversation with some facts. And I was shocked to discover that the number of people who believe that is not 100%, including the majority of our political class. So if you can operate in a fact-free universe because you think it's funny or whatever, then I guess you get the consequences of the people that you elect, or the television that you watch and the sponsors who feed them, because it's entertainment. And to me, it's irresponsible. So my position, is the old quote of, we can disagree over everything, but we can't disagree over facts. And so facts are, and for those of you who have questions about this, science resolved this by saying that a fact is something which is reproducible, and otherwise it's a theory. And you see now, lots and lots of examples where people are trying to attack basic fact in science. This is not a new behavior in America. Go back to the Scopes trial in Kansas in the 1930s. So this is not a new problem. And again, I go back to my answer, which is education of people to be critical thinking. The reason that your question is so important is that the internet gives people an opportunity to generate lies faster and for business reasons. The example I would use is, imagine that we had the smoking companies in the 1960s, and this is well documented that they had this whole misinformation campaign. Well, how would it work now if they were doing this now? And thank goodness they're not doing it anymore. They would have a massive program on the internet convincing you that smoking was not harmful, and then eventually the doctors and all the smart people who had looked at this would say, this is like crazy. But you'd have this huge action against their misinformation, right? And part of the reason that search engines matter is a search engine should be able to eventually detect between. Although there might be a period where it was so overwhelmingly snowed by these falsehoods that it could lead to a wrong conclusion for a while.
Can I? Your question actually triggered a different narrative for me in some respects, which I also think is really important. We spent a lot of time in the Middle East and North Africa, which for the last couple of years have been engulfed in various revolutions of different degrees of success. Everyone that we talk to identifies the same problem, right? So revolutions become easier to start and harder to finish. They're easier to start because you can get a lot of people into the streets, and they're harder to finish because once they're in the streets and the dictator's gone, you don't know what to do. The reason this ties to your question is when you have so many people organizing so quickly, it's very easy to organize around the lowest common denominator, and when that's get the bad dictator out of power, that's fine. So then Gaddafi falls, Mubarak falls, Ben Ali falls, Saleh falls in Yemen, and then what happens? You're still figuring out what to do next based around the lowest common denominator, and you find that that doesn't work. So the question that I always ask engineers is there a way to essentially explore argument mapping that doesn't center around the lowest common denominator, but in essence takes all of the sort of complaining, all the noise, and comes up with a mathematical answer for what the crowd says should be done next that isn't essentially the superficial lowest common denominator.
And there are attempts in AI to do this by deriving underlying results. Part of the issue is the ambiguity of language and so forth. But it's possible that in our lifetimes we'll get really quite good at understanding intent, meaning, and eventually to develop a real sense of how to answer a question of truth.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Eddie Wiseman, a native Los Angelino. Growing up in America, where the melting pot has been thrown around so much, the internet is finally creating a borderless country of people of all races, religions, social, and other behaviors. Who do you expect will come forward to create a constitution or bylaws for this new country that is engulfing the planet?
Well, we describe, in the book, we describe the internet as the world's largest ungoverned space, and it seems to be getting bigger, and it doesn't seem to be getting governed anytime soon. The real observation we make is as all these countries come online, remember 57% of the world's population lives under autocracy. So they're going to find that it's hard enough to implement the laws of the physical world, let alone trying to do it in cyberspace. And the natural reaction for a lot of these governments is going to be to balkanize the internet. And so what you might have is, in a situation where you have a balkanized internet, you may have like-minded states banding together to actually edit the web in collaboration. So imagine a Sunni Islamic autocratic cyber union where they all filter in the same way.
Or we decide to get rid of the Kurds from the internet, because we couldn't fight them in real space. The internet does have a funny kind of constitution, because it was built largely under American law and American institutions. It tends to reflect some American biases, that of free speech and of full connectivity and so forth. Do a thought experiment and imagine if the Chinese had invented the internet. It would have a great much to do with the protocols of containing information, checking users, and verifying your identity, which it does not have today.
And of course, Eric, you and I, when we got back from Myanmar, made an interesting observation on this point, which is you have less than 1% of Burmese citizens connected to the internet, yet every single one of them understood the internet. And they understood it as a set of values, and those values were largely democratic. But until 18 months ago, this was the second worst dictatorship in the world behind North Korea. And so where it gets interesting is the vast majority of the world's population that isn't connected today will come to experience the internet as a concept before they experience it as a user. And so what happens when some of these dictatorships or these autocracies try to build the internet in a way that looks more like China, and it clashes with perceptions of what the internet should be that are reflective more of Western Europe and the United States?
Let me ask you, gentlemen, very quickly. You in the book, you talk about sort of the culture and country of real space and the culture or country of cyberspace. And do you mean that, how real do you mean? Is it a metaphor? Is it an analogy? Or do you really mean that we sort of think differently in these two different realms?
It's quite real. I mean, I think every human being can relate to the notion of people will do and say things online that they wouldn't do in the physical world. And it's the same thing with countries. Countries will do things to each other in cyberspace that they would never do in the physical space.
And I would answer your question by saying that think of one limiting the other. If you get too wild and crazy in cyberspace, the physical world will come and arrest you. If you, in the physical world, start doing things which are horrific, people in the internet will notice this and there will be a reaction. Each one checks the other, not necessarily in a bad way. Yes, sir.
The book's been fascinating, and the things that you've been going through. And you talk about a lot of things that companies may do wrong, or the governments may do wrong, or how people react, and a lot of talk about the idea of identity and such like that. And I'm wondering, especially for you, Eric, how has that changed what you think Google should be doing? Has it changed anything specifically? Have you said, we've got to stop doing this, we need to start doing that? And you know, you've kind of written this blueprint of where technological history and culture and everything will be going, and you've fairly influential at Google, so you could change some of those things.
And you should identify yourself, by the way.
Danny Sullivan from Search Engine Land.
And Danny's covered Google for a very long time and is a good friend. I think the simplest answer, this process got me to respect the interaction between the digital world and the real world more. Again, people at Google, and certainly myself, assume that we can just sort of do what we think is right. But in fact, the other organizations will react, and we spend a lot of time talking about that reaction. And I think the Google that you covered 7 or 8 years ago wouldn't have had that conversation. The Google today has that conversation. So for example, we brought out Google Glass, which is a fantastic innovation, but we're also limiting its distribution. We're studying how it's going to be used. We're not just throwing it over the wall the way we did in 2004, 2005, which you know very well, Danny.
My name is Hank Leber. I run a social media company called Gonna Be, based on the intent of what's going to be happening next that you were referring to earlier. My question is about the concept of text skipping. A few years ago, that was coined when you saw, members of developing nations. Their first experience with the internet was actually on mobile. They never had a computer.
Yeah,
they never
jumped right to the front.
Right, they jumped. So they skipped to their first tech experience being highly interactive and advanced. I'm sure in the past few years that's only gotten more prominent. Are you seeing that concept will play a major role in these next 5 years as to the importance of mobile compounded into this huge growth, and how does that change the rollouts? This
is an excellent question. The sort of hegemony over the last decade was that somehow the people who were behind would skip to the front because they would be able to skip all the infrastructure that we'd had to build while we were still trying to figure it out. They skip right to mobile. But in fact, in the book, we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that while they're skipping to mobile, the people who have mobile are skipping to a gigabit fiber. And in fact, that gap, as we said earlier, becomes larger, which I found is I'm unhappy with that result, but we think that's correct.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Richard Grossman. I'm CTO of a small mobile startup, but I've also been CTO of a big hedge fund. My next thing, though, that I'm really committed to is creating technology that helps people connect to the internet in spite of various obstacles, whether it's remoteness, disasters, or censorship. And so I was really excited when I got the invitation tonight, and I'm about halfway through your book. And coming in here tonight, the guy who was checking in ahead of me, he's working in a similar area to combat censorship. It was just coming here tonight, I made at least one great contact. And what I'm thinking is, what opportunities are there for companies working in areas that support the kind of connectivity, worldwide connectivity, to work with Google? I think it would be really cool to start an incubator in Santa Monica that was just about connectivity technology.
Thomas is right here, and so we'll take that as input.
And I also think it would be great if, coming out of tonight, Jared, if you'd come back down here maybe in a month and start a community of people that are interested and get them together so we could talk to each other. And
well, I love your perspective and couldn't agree with it more. Let me take what you said and put it in the context of a place like Iran. Obviously, the US has been connected for a long time. You all here have been connected for quite some time. In Iran, that's not so much the case. It's really been a phenomenon of the last, I would say five years, maybe a little bit less. When I started at Google 2.5 years ago, there were almost no smartphones in Iran. Now there's literally millions. So it's happening very fast. Pre-internet, pre-mobile in these environments, how could somebody like you who wants to change the world, wants to promote free how on earth could you help the 72 million people living under a terrible regime in Iran? They would never give you a visa. If they did, you'd end up in Evans prison, and it wouldn't be a pleasant experience. Now you have the opportunity to be an altruistic transnational meddler in the way that's very constructive for the rest of the world.
And is legal.
And is legal.
By the way, the best way to get connectivity established to start with is to smuggle micro SD cards into the feature phones that are already in place in war zones. We encounter this in South Sudan. It's extraordinary courage, carrying chips full of information to information-starved people. There are quite a few NGOs that are now working on, think of them as mesh networks of phones, where if enough of us have a phone, the peer-to-peer, whether it's Bluetooth-powered or frequency-agile phones, can actually form that network and get around the centralized control. The key aspect of telecommunications today is it's still not fully peer-to-peer. That is a benefit if you're worried about what people are doing, and it's a real problem if you want those people to be doing things while the government's trying to shut down the net.
But there's somebody made the point.
And I think I have a way to do it, by the way.
But somebody made the point before about how do you decide what to do, and Eric responded to that by saying we hope that one product has multiple uses, and this is a perfect example. The type of mesh network that you're describing is useful not just for a situation where a government like Iran or Syria or Egypt shuts down the network. It's useful in a Maasai village in Kenya.
Well, but all on reconstruction. Think about it in Haiti, where the transmission towers are down, and the only thing, as long as you have a solar panel, you got some electricity, off you go. Thank you. Let's have our next.
Is there any way we could come out of this tonight with, in addition to the inspiration, some kind of actionable community?
Why don't we take that as feedback for Thomas?
Okay.
Let's have
All
our
right, great.
next
Thank
question.
you. Thank you very much.
And we're also sort of running up against time here.
Let's see if we can do the last few
I think we've
questions real
got
fast.
3 folks, so if you'll
let's do
make
these
your
real
remarks
fast.
direct, we would appreciate it.
Hello, my name is Rickman Wong. I'm a freelance web developer. And my question feels very much like a first world problem compared to a lot of what we're talking about tonight in terms of like Rwanda and developing nations. I was just wondering what it would take and how long it would take for internet speeds in the US to kind of like reach levels that are currently like available in places like Japan and other countries where they have like really fast
A lot
internet
depends on
access.
how you think Google Fiber will work.
And do you have plans to bring it to LA?
Let me give you the numbers. The most recent survey of internet connectivity in America is that the average download speed is about 9 megabits, which turns out to be about 9th in the world. Number 1 is South Korea at 160. Number 2 is Tokyo at number at 100. Singapore is next at 90. Those kinds of numbers. So you see how big the gap is. Google has announced Google Fiber in 3 communities, and we're running those tests. We'll decide whether we can expand or not. There's evidence that additional competition in the telecommunications industry causes speeds to go up and prices to go down. What a shock.
Cool, thank you.
Hi, my name is Nicole Johnson, Director of Partnerships at iUrban Teen Tech, and my question is pertaining to the role that perception plays. And you were mentioning earlier about growing that next generation of engineers and computer scientists, and that there's this huge giant hole, gaping hole, I suppose. It's just my opinion that self-perception, everything starts with self-perception. Besides the actual technology itself being in your hand or being technologically inclined, kids in Watts, kids in Compton, all over the country that are in those economically disadvantaged areas, how can Google go beyond the technology and actually begin to change their self-perception? Because once you can change that self-perception, you can actually get to points where you think you can be an engineer, or you think you can be a computer scientist.
The best idea that I've seen is something called a Raspberry Pi, Raspberry Pi. Google donated a large number of those in Cambridge, England. And it looks like if you can get simple computers that connect to your television that are graphics intensive, people who are, kids who are naturally curious will become programmers. So I think if we get the technology in the sort of age critical, 12, 13, 14, it will happen.
Thank you.
Could I add one thing to that? I don't know if my mic's on.
Thomas, go ahead.
It was a local question, and we actually run a program called Coderdojo with the Coderdojo people in LA that helps, especially kids from underserved communities, come in, sit with Googlers, and learn about computer science and programs. And they're here, and you can talk to each other.
Raise your hand.
They're awesome. Thank you for coming.
Right up there. Thank you.
So I just want to point that out. You can talk to people that are in the room.
Oh, no, fantastic. We're actually going to be hosting our next event. It's kind of an all-day workshop for teenagers to kind of be completely immersed in technology.
But this is incredibly important, right? because it's not only an escalator for the people, but it's the nature of how America will compete in the next 20 to 30 years. So don't think of yourself as solving one person's problem. Think of solving the nation's problem.
No, even internationally. I mean, self-perception. Once you think you can, you can.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Let's have this gentleman have the honor of the last question.
Thank you so much. My name is Alejandro Bernal, and I'm here, with Urban Teens Exploring Technology, and basically my question is about the future generation too. Which
are you a member of this future generation?
I am. Thank you. Yeah, I'm 17. I'm on my.
Then you should answer the question.
Yeah.
You think we know what's going to happen?
He has to ask the question first.
No. But I mean, but he's about to talk about his own generation. What do we know? We're too old.
I want to hear the. I want to hear the question.
Yes, you are.
Hey, wait a minute.
You're twice his age.
I'm going to plug their book one more time. It says, there's a quote here from somebody named Charles Kettering, which says, "We should all be concerned about the future because we will all have to spend the rest of our lives there."
So go ahead with your question.
And we should mention we found that quote on the internet.
By the way,
of course.
We're just having fun with you. Go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you again. No, well, my question is, again, to repeat about the future generation of, engineers, entrepreneurs, and as myself, I see myself as a coder. So what type of advice can you give me to, stay in what I am right now, because through urban text, I gain a lot of experience.
What language are you programming in?
Huh?
What language are you programming in?
HTML. I know how to do Java.
Okay, you're going to be wealthy beyond your belief. Stay exactly. This, by the way, this guy's got more judgment than most everyone I have met. Do exactly what you're doing, and don't let anyone disable you.
Yeah, and this I thank Urban Text for this, and
I mean. People like yourself at the age of 22, 23, 24, right? So after you get through college and work real hard and all those kinds of things and have a good time, are getting salary offers that have at least the possibility of $5 or $10 million in compensation. That's how valuable HTML5 and Java skills are today in the market. You are so perfectly positioned. I wish we had 1 million people just like you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's thank our two guests.
Thanks,
as
everybody.
Well.